In this video, we're going to talk about what to do with invalid and inconsistent data in our list concatenation macros and how to deal with user error. The first thing we want to look at is how to deal with blank rows. So let's first add a few blank rows in our customer number list. In the VBA, we're going to use our special concat commas macro. We'll copy that over and rename. And we're going to go into the for each loop, and before we concatenate the values, we will check if the cell is blank. And we'll do this by using an if statement. If the concat value is not blank, we will proceed with the concatenation process. And here we will end our if and test it out. And we can see that our concatenated string does not have any blank spaces. If it did, it would have a space, a comma, and then it would proceed to the next number. So the next thing we want to consider is when we have placeholders. Perhaps the database uses a number such as -1 or some other number or characters to show where values are missing, but the field is not null. We will add a few -1s to our customer number data set, and then back in the VBA, we can simply add another condition to our if statement. And we're going to use the AND keyword because we're also using the NOT keyword. So the way this reads is that if the concat value is not blank and it is not 1, then we will proceed with the concatenation process. And when we run this, we see we have just the expected concatenation values. So the next thing we want to consider is when we have trailing white spaces at the end of each of our customer numbers. For this, we'll add a few spaces to each of these values. Before we make changes to the macro, I want you to see what this looks like before we trim off the white spaces. Back in the VBA, we will need a new string variable, and we will call this concateval1. Inside our for loop, before the if statement, we will use our new variable to trim the concat value that is coming in. And we will add the number 1 at the end of the concat value variable throughout the rest of the for each loop. We also need to put our -1 into double quotes because using the trim function will make our concat value 1 a string. In order for this to run, we need to make our conditional value a string as well. You may wonder why we don't use the same variable as we did with the concat string. If we make the concat value equal to the trim of itself, from that point on, the data type would be reassigned to a string. For this macro, it wouldn't change anything. However, if we want to modify this later, which we will no longer be able to use any other information that had once been provided by using the for each loop, such as the location of the concat value. And when we run this, we see we have the trimmed customer numbers only. Now we want to consider what happens when the active column doesn't have data. If we run our macro on an empty column, we will be taken to the VBA and shown a non-descriptive error. If you are the only one using this macro, you would know that you just didn't have the right column. Then you would reset the macro and run it again with a column that contained data. However, if you set this up for someone else who doesn't use VBA, they might panic thinking that they've broken something. So what we want to do, if the macro is running on an empty column, is to send a message to the user to remind them to only use this on a column with data. And then we want to exit the subroutine before it runs and throws the error. In the VBA, we want to start our code after the last row has been calculated, since our concatenation starts at the second row. This way, the last row may be equal to 1 if we have a header in the column, but the column itself is still empty. So we will use an if statement to say if the last row is less than 2, we want a message box asking the user to select the right type of column with an OK only button, and we will give it a descriptive title for the error. Then we will exit the subroutine. So we'll reset, save, and run, and we get a nice error message. So now we'll click OK. And then we want to run this properly so that we show that the macro itself still works. And here we have our customer number string. The last thing we're going to look at in this video is when your data is inconsistent. This can happen when you have some data that is a string and other data that is a number. For some search engines and SQL searches, you may need to wrap the strings in single quotes, but not the numbers. We're going to use our special concat commas again, and we'll use the new one that we've created that has the error checkers. And we're going to rename this to special concat switching data types. So we're going to use a nested if statement. Inside our first if statement, we will start another if statement. And this one will check if our concat value is a number by using the worksheet function isNumber. If this is true, then we will use our commas only. If it is not true, or else, we will use the concat string with the single quotes. And when we run this, we see that only the strings have single quotes and the numbers do not. In the next video, we will talk about using values from two columns. And we will also talk about switching our subroutines to functions.